Now, picture a cold, damp Tuesday afternoon at the passenger station in Mist River, Oregon. The air smells of wet concrete, diesel exhaust, and rain threatening to pour from heavy gray clouds. Garrett Callahan is 58 years old, carrying a heavy iron water pump for a 1968 Dodge Charger he spent 6 months restoring in his shop down on Mill Street. He's got grease under his fingernails, a worn canvas jacket pulled tight against the chill, and the quiet, steady focus of a man who hasn't expected anything surprising from life in 20 years. Then the crowd on platform 3 parts, and Garrett's heart stops dead in his chest. Standing near the automated ticket kiosk, wrapped in a faded wool coat, is a woman whose face he buried 2 decades ago. Her hair is streaked with gray now, her frame thinner than he remembers, her posture nervous, her eyes scanning the station exits like someone who's spent 20 years learning never to stay in one place too long. And standing beside her is a girl no older than 20, with dark hair, a sharp jawline, and eyes that hit Garrett like a punch to the ribs. They are gray, an exact, piercing shade of iron gray that Garrett has seen every morning in his own bathroom mirror, and in the face of his 28-year-old son, Jesse. Before Garrett can make sense of the room spinning beneath his boots, he steps forward and speaks her name into the damp air. Helena. The woman flinches as if she's been struck. Her eyes lock onto his, filled with sudden, terrifying panic. She grabs the young girl's elbow, turning fast toward the street doors. "Don't say my name," she whispers, her voice raspy and trembling as he catches up to them on the slick pavement outside. "Please, Garrett. Don't look at me, and don't say my name. Someone is still watching. She's a ghost, Garrett, and you're just a washed-up grease monkey trying to extort my company," a voice would say to him 3 days later, the voice of Julian Sterling, a man worth $3 billion. But what Julian didn't know on that rain-soaked afternoon was that in exactly 72 hours, the 21-year-old girl standing in Garrett's greasy back room would hold 51% of his entire global empire in her hands. What was buried inside a dusty mahogany machinist's chest sitting in the corner of a small-town garage that could tear down one of the most powerful corporate dynasties in the Pacific Northwest? To understand the sheer weight of what happened outside that train station, you have to understand the life Garrett Callahan built out of the ashes of his youth. 20 years ago, the local sheriff and a dive team pulled a scorched, crushed station wagon out of 30 feet of black water at Mist Lake. The fire had gutted the frame. The coroner signed a certificate, handed Garrett a manila folder, and told him his 26-year-old wife was gone. Garrett was left alone in a 3-room house with a 3-year-old boy named Jesse, a mortgage he could barely cover, and a grief so heavy he learned to bury it under 80-hour workweeks at his auto repair shop. He raised Jesse on grease, cold sandwiches, and quiet nights spent teaching the boy how to rebuild carburetors. Jesse grew up, moved to Seattle, and made something of himself as a forensic data auditor, a man who lived in numbers and spreadsheets, rarely coming back to Mist River except on holidays. Garrett made his peace with the silence. He didn't date. He didn't talk about the past. He just worked on old muscle cars, listened to late-night ball games on a transistor radio, and kept his head down. So when he grabbed Helena's wrist outside the train station that afternoon, every single year of that quiet, carefully constructed life blew apart in a fraction of a second. "Get in the truck," Garrett said, his voice low, hard, and shaking with an anger he hadn't felt in 20 years. "Both of you. Right now." Helena didn't argue. She darted a quick glance toward a black, late-model Lincoln Navigator idling across the avenue with dark-tinted glass, then pushed the younger girl into the bench seat of Garrett's '94 Ford F-150. Garrett slammed his door, threw it into gear, and hauled out into the traffic before the rain could turn into a full downpour. Nobody spoke for the first 4 miles. The cab of the truck smelled of wet wool, old vinyl, and engine oil. Garrett kept his hands clamped on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his knuckles white, staring straight ahead while his mind raced through 20 years of funeral flowers, unpaid hospital bills, and sleepless nights holding a crying toddler. He drove them straight to the back alley behind Vance Classic Auto Restoration. He pulled the truck into the dark storage bay, hit the chain hoist to bring the heavy overhead door down with a deafening rattle, and locked the deadbolt. The storage bay was cold, lit only by a single 40-watt bulb hanging from an exposed rafter over shelves stacked with rust-pitted intake manifolds, brass fittings, and old oil drums. Garrett turned around, unzipped his work jacket, and faced the two women. "You're dead," Garrett said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a blade edge that made the young girl step back slightly behind Helena. "I buried an empty box in Oak Ridge Cemetery. I paid $8,000 for a stone with your name carved into it. Now you're standing in my shop." Helena pulled off her wet scarf with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Garrett, I know what you think. I know what this looks like." "You don't know a damn thing about what I think," Garrett snapped, stepping closer, his boots crunching on the oil-stained gravel floor. He pointed a long, calloused finger straight at the younger girl. "Who is she, Helena? Who is this?" The room went completely still, save for the steady rhythm of rain pounding against the corrugated tin roof above them. The girl looked up. She stepped out from behind Helena, her jaw set in a line that Garrett recognized instantly. It was the exact same stubborn set his father had possessed, the same look Jesse got whenever he was backed into a corner. "My name is Clara," the girl said quietly. Her voice was steady, though her hands were clenching the hem of her jacket. "Clara Finch. At least, that's the name on my high school diploma. My mother told me 2 weeks ago that my real last name is Callahan." Garrett felt the air leave his lungs like he'd been struck with a sledgehammer. He staggered back half a step, leaning his hip against the fender of a disassembled Dodge Charger. He looked from Clara's gray eyes to Helena's face. "No. No, that's impossible. You weren't pregnant when you disappeared." "I was 6 weeks along, Garrett," Helena said softly, tears finally overflowing her lower lids and carving clear tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "I didn't even know myself until 4 days before the car went into Mist Lake. I was going to tell you on Friday night. I had bought a small silver frame for the ultrasound picture. It was sitting in my purse the night Burl Higgins came to our front door." The name dropped into the quiet space between them like a cold stone. Burl Higgins. Garrett remembered him. 20 years ago, Burl was the broad-shouldered, quiet director of private security for Sterling Maritime Holdings, the massive shipping and logistics conglomerate founded by Helena's father, Augustus Sterling. Now, you have to understand something about Helena's family. When Garrett married Helena back in 1998, her family treated him like something she'd picked up on the bottom of her shoe. The Sterlings were Seattle royalty, old timber and shipping money, corporate boardrooms, glass skyscrapers, and politicians on speed dial. Garrett was a grease monkey working out of a rented 2-bay garage with $3,000 in his savings account. Augustus Sterling had refused to attend the wedding, and when Augustus died a year later, control of Sterling Maritime passed not to Helena, but to her uncle, Julian Sterling. Julian was a man who wore $4,000 tailored suits, drove foreign sports cars, and viewed people as either assets to be bought or liabilities to be erased. "Why?" Garrett asked, his chest heaving as he stared at Helena. "Why would you let me believe you were dead? Why would you leave Jesse? He was 3 years old, Helena. He cried at the front door every night for 6 months waiting for your car to pull into the driveway." Helena choked back a sob, pressing her hands over her face. Clara reached out, taking her mother's arm, her young face tight with a mix of fierce protection and deep, unresolved pain. "She didn't leave because she wanted to, Mr. Callahan," Clara said, her voice cutting through the damp air. "She left because if she didn't, your son would have been killed." Garrett took a long, slow breath through his nose. "Explain it to me. Every single word. And it better be the absolute truth, or so help me God, I'm calling the county sheriff right now." Helena lowered her hands, her face pale under the harsh yellow glow of the hanging bulb. She sat down on an overturned wooden crate, her fingers tightly wrapped around a cold, paper coffee cup she'd been holding since the station. "3 weeks before I disappeared," Helena began, her voice dropping to a low, measured rhythm, "I was working in the records archive at Sterling Maritime's headquarters in Tacoma. I was helping settle my father's final estate papers. I came across a series of wire transfers, transactions authorized by Uncle Julian over a 4-year period. He had systematically siphoned $210 million out of the company's employee pension fund. $210 million, Garrett. Money meant for dock workers, crane operators, and secretaries who had worked 30 years for the company." Garrett frowned. $200 million. How could nobody notice that? He routed it through 11 different shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands and Liechtenstein, Helena explained. And to cover his tracks, he forged my father's signature on dozens of financial authorizations dated just months before he died. He was framing my dead father to protect himself. When I realized what I was looking at, I copied the files onto a thumb drive. I made an appointment to meet with an attorney at the Federal Building in Seattle." She paused, closing her eyes as a violent shudder ran through her shoulders. "Julian found out," Helena continued. "I don't know if he was tracking my office computer or if someone in accounting tipped him off, but 2 nights before my appointment, I came home from the grocery store. You were at the shop finishing a clutch job on a farm tractor. Jesse was sleeping in his crib. Sitting on our kitchen table was a plain manila envelope. Inside were 16 photographs. Photos of you at the shop through a sniper lens. Photos of Jesse playing in the sandbox at his preschool. And a note in Julian's handwriting that said, *, accidents happen to little boys every day. *. Garrett felt an icy knot twist in his gut. The grease on his hands felt suddenly cold. "I panicked," Helena whispered. "I was going to call the police, but that same night, Burl Higgins showed up at our back door. Burl wasn't just Julian's security director, he was an old friend of my father's. He told me Julian had already paid 2 men from Portland to set a fire at your garage while you were inside working late. Burl said the only way to save you and Jesse was if I ceased to exist. Completely. Permanently. Because as long as Julian thought I was alive and holding those records, he would consider you and Jesse leverage. So Burl staged the wreck," Garrett said, his voice flat. "He found a burned-out wagon at a scrap yard in Eugene," Helena said. "They towed it to Mist Lake in the middle of the night, poured accelerant inside, pushed it off the ledge into the deepest channel, and set it off. Burl had a contact at the county coroner's office, a woman who owed him a massive personal favor, who substituted the dental records on the victim report. By morning, the whole world believed I was dead. Burl drove me across the state line into Idaho that night with $5,000 in cash and a forged birth certificate." Garrett leaned back against the Dodge Charger, staring up at the dark corrugated ceiling. The rain was coming down harder now, a steady, deafening roar against the tin. 20 years of pain, 20 years of self-doubt, 20 years of sitting alone at his kitchen table wondering what he could have done differently that night, all of it engineered by a corporate sociopath in a tailored suit. "You could have come back," Garrett said, his voice dropping an octave, thick with unspent fury. "After 6 months. After a year. After 5 years. You left me alone, Helena. I broke my back working 60 hours a week to pay off the mortgage and keep Jesse fed. I didn't sleep for 3 years because every time I closed my eyes, I saw that lake. I tried." Helena cried out, her voice breaking. "You think I wanted to live in greasy 2-room apartments in Montana? You think I wanted to wash dishes under a fake name while my son grew up without a mother? Burl was my only link to home. Every 6 months, he sent me a plain envelope with 3 photographs of Jesse, proof that he was alive, proof that you were safe. But Burl warned me every single time, Julian's people were still watching Mist River. Julian was terrified that I had hidden hard copies of the pension file somewhere before I fled. She took a ragged breath, reaching into her worn coat pocket. She pulled out a small, plastic-wrapped bundle and set it on the workbench next to Garrett's socket sets. 8 years ago, Helena said, the photographs stopped coming. I tried to call the untraceable cell number Burl had given me, it was disconnected. I didn't know if Burl had been caught, if he had retired, or if he had sold me out to Julian. I was terrified that if I stepped foot back in Oregon, would bring Julian's enforcement right to your front door. So I stayed hidden. I raised Clara in a small logging town near the Canadian border. We lived like ghosts, Garrett. Garrett looked down at the plastic-wrapped bundle on the workbench. He reached out with trembling fingers and pulled back the plastic. Inside were dozens of small, square photographs. Jesse's first day of kindergarten. Jesse playing Little League baseball in his oversized red cap. Jesse standing on the stage at his high school graduation holding a diploma. Every single milestone Garrett had celebrated alone, Helena had watched it from afar through a lens held by a dead man. What changed? Garrett asked quietly, looking up at her. Why come back now? Why risk everything today? Helena looked across the shop at Clara. The young girl stood tall, her jaw tight, meeting Garrett's gaze head-on. Because 3 days from now, Helena said, on Friday, October 14th. Clara turns 21. Garrett frowned. What does her birthday have to do with Julian Sterling? Helena reached into her shoulder bag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound document with yellowed edges. She laid it flat on the hood of the Dodge Charger under the swinging 40-watt bulb. When my father, Augustus Sterling, died 24 years ago, Helena explained, he didn't leave Julian in total control of Sterling Maritime. He created a revocable trust that held 51% of the voting shares, the controlling interest in the entire company. Julian was only granted temporary management stewardship of those shares, under one explicit condition, that I died without leaving behind a legitimate biological heir. Garrett's eyes widened as the pieces began to collide in his head. Julian thought I died childless in Mist Lake, Helena said, her voice turning sharp and hard as steel. He spent 20 years operating as the absolute ruler of Sterling Maritime under that assumption. But tucked deep inside Section 14 of my father's trust agreement is a hidden clause. It states that if a living biological heir reaches the age of 21, the temporary stewardship immediately terminates. Control of the 51% voting stock automatically transfers to the heir, and that transfer triggers an immediate, non-negotiable, mandatory forensic audit of every bank account, pension fund, and corporate ledger controlled by the board. An audit, Garrett repeated, the mechanic in him recognizing the trap closing. An audit that Julian cannot stop, delay, or bribe his way out of, Helena said. If Clara claims her legal inheritance on her 21st birthday, Julian's $210 million pension theft will be exposed to the Federal Reserve within 48 hours. He will go to federal prison for the rest of his natural life. And Julian knows this? Garrett asked. He didn't, until 10 days ago, Helena said. Julian is currently in the middle of closing a $4 billion deal to sell Sterling Maritime to a state-owned foreign investment consortium based in Dubai. The deal is scheduled to close on Friday at midnight. If that sale goes through before Clara asserts her right, the company's assets will be moved offshore into non-regulated holding accounts. The pension money will be gone forever, and the evidence of his forgery will be buried under foreign banking secrecy laws. Helena leaned in close, her eyes locked on Garrett's. Julian found out Clara exists 2 weeks ago. I don't know how, maybe a leak in the civil registry where I applied for her adult state ID. But 4 days ago, a black SUV pulled up outside our rental house in Washington. We barely escaped through the back window with the clothes on our backs. We came to Mist River because of one final message Burl Higgins left behind before he died last month. Garrett's heart gave a heavy thud. Burl is dead. He died of cancer 4 weeks ago, Helena said softly. His estate lawyer sent me an automated video message that was set to release upon his death. In that video, Burl confessed that before he helped me disappear, he took the original, certified copy of my father's trust clause, the physical document bearing the original legal seals, and hid it. He knew Julian would destroy any official copy in the county clerk's office if he ever found it. Burl said he hid the original document inside the one place Julian Sterling's men would never think to search. Helena reached out and laid her palm gently on Garrett's forearm. Her touch was warm, familiar, and so intense it made Garrett's breath catch in his throat. Burl hid it right here, Garrett, she whispered. Inside the mahogany machinist's chest I gave you on the day you opened this garage. Garrett froze. He turned his head slowly, looking past the Dodge Charger toward the far back corner of his office. There, sitting on top of a steel filing cabinet under a layer of quarter-inch shop dust, was a dark mahogany toolbox with heavy brass corner brackets and double-lever latches. Helena had bought it for him at an estate sale in 1999, just 3 months before she vanished. Garrett had kept his most precise measuring tools inside it, his micrometer, dial indicators, and feeler gauges, for over 20 years. He'd touched it 10,000 times without ever suspecting it held the key to a $3 billion empire. "Come on," Garrett said, his voice stripped of all emotion. He walked into the small glass-walled office, clicked on the overhead fluorescent lights, and reached up to grab the heavy mahogany chest. As he blew the gray dust off the brass lid, a sudden cold draft swept through the garage. Garrett stopped. He looked toward the side pedestrian door that led out to the alley. The brass lock on the door frame was bent outward. The wood around the deadbolt was splintered. "Garrett!" Helena gasped, stepping up behind him, her hand flying to her mouth. Garrett set the chest down on his desk and pulled open the door to his inner supply closet. The room was total chaos. Steel drawer units had been dumped onto the floor. Shelves had been ripped off the studs. Old repair orders and manuals were scattered like dry leaves across the concrete floor. And scrawled across the white drywall behind the desk, written in thick, greasy black spray paint, were 8 words. "The dead should know better than to return." Clara stepped into the doorway, her gray eyes widening as she took in the mess. "They've already been here." Garrett didn't panic. 20 years of working on broken-down machinery had taught him one vital lesson: when things go wrong, you don't panic, you analyze the damage. He walked back to the mahogany chest sitting on his desk. The brass latches were untouched. The lock hadn't been picked. The intruders had torn the office apart looking for legal papers, but they'd walked right past the heavy wooden box sitting in plain sight, assuming it was just another piece of garage trash. Garrett pulled a brass key off his key ring, inserted it into the chest's center lock, and popped the latches. He lifted the top lid, exposing the felt-lined tray holding his vintage Starrett micrometers. He lifted the top tray out, then the second tray. He reached down to the bottom of the empty mahogany box and tapped the quarter-inch oak floor with his knuckle. Asterisk thump. Thump, asterisk. Then he moved his finger 2 inches to the left and tapped again. Hollow. "It's got a double bottom," Garrett muttered. He took a flathead pocket screwdriver from his shirt pocket, inserted the tip into the subtle seam along the rear brass hinge, and pried upward. With a quiet pop, the thin oak false bottom lifted free, releasing the faint smell of cedar, oil, and 20-year-old paper. Lying in the recessed compartment was not a thick legal document. It was a single, velvet-lined jeweler's box, and next to it, a small brass key taped to an index card with a 6-digit number written in dark blue ink, 440912. Garrett picked up the jeweler's box and opened the latch. Sitting on the black velvet was an antique, heavy silver pocket watch engraved with the initials A.S., Augustus Sterling. "That was my father's watch," Helena said, her voice barely a whisper. "Julian took it off his desk the night he died." "How did Burl get it?" Garrett picked up the watch. He turned it over in his rough hands. He pressed the small stem release on the top. The front cover popped open, exposing the intricate, ticking Swiss gears inside. But tucked inside the back casing, pressed flat behind the glass cover of the balance wheel, was a folded slip of thin parchment paper. Garrett carefully unpinned the back casing with his precision screwdriver and pulled out the parchment. He unfolded it under the desk lamp. It wasn't the trust document itself. It was a receipt for a safety deposit box registered at the First National Bank of Oregon, main branch in downtown Portland, under the name of Burl Higgins and Augustus Sterling Trust Account. The date on the receipt was October 12, 2004, exactly 20 years ago. "The original trust clause isn't in this garage," Garrett said, looking up at Helena. "Burl locked it in a bank vault in Portland. And that 6-digit number on the index card is the access code for the vault. Now, if you've lived long enough, you know that finding the key is only half the battle. The easy half, usually. The hard part is walking up to the door when the people holding the handle have millions of dollars and an army of lawyers standing behind them." Day 14. 34 hours before Julian's legal team was scheduled to step onto the county courthouse steps and officially declare Helena's family estate abandoned. 34 hours. Picture the main branch of the First National Bank in downtown Portland at 8 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday morning. Marble floors so polished you can see your own reflection, ceiling soaring 3 stories high, and that distinct, heavy smell of wet wool coats, expensive floor wax, and cold brass. Helena walked through those bronze double doors holding her breath. In her coat pocket, wrapped in a soft cotton rag, was her father's silver pocket watch. Garrett walked right beside her, wearing his good dark wool coat, the one he bought 22 years ago for his wife's funeral, and carrying that small brass key in his hand. They didn't get 10 feet past the velvet ropes before a young assistant vice president in a tailored gray suit stepped out from behind a polished oak desk. His name badge said Mr. Vance. He had slick back hair, teeth that looked like they cost more than Garrett's pickup truck, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes for a single second. "Mrs. Sterling," Vance said, his voice clipped and smooth as silk. "We were notified by Julian Sterling's counsel late yesterday afternoon. An estate freeze has been registered against all assets tied to Augustus Sterling. I'm afraid I cannot allow access to any safe deposit boxes under that name." Helena's hand went straight to her pocket, her fingers closing tight around the silver pocket watch. "This isn't an estate box, Mr. Vance," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's a joint account. Registered 20 years ago." Vance didn't even look at the paper in her hand. He just gave that thin, rehearsed sigh that corporate people use when they want you to feel small. "It doesn't matter, ma'am. Until the probate judge signs off on Thursday morning, everything is locked down. Company policy. Legal obligation." What would you have done right there? Most people would have turned around, walked out into the rain, and waited for Thursday, which was exactly what Julian counted on. Garrett didn't move an inch. He stood there on that slick marble, 6'2" of quiet Oregon timber country patience, looking at this young banker who couldn't have been a day over 30. "Mr. Vance," Garrett said, his voice low and warm, like gravel rolling in a bucket. "You ever read the original charter for this branch? 1978. Vance blinked. "Excuse me." 1978, Garrett repeated quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get angry. He reached inside his coat pocket, pulled out his old leather card wallet, and pulled out a faded blue plastic card with a gold seal stamped into the corner. He laid it flat on the banker's oak desk. It was a Master Locksmith and Vault Security Inspector card from the state of Oregon, issued in 1989. And here's the part nobody in that grand marble lobby knew: before Garrett ever bought his repair shop, before he spent 30 years fixing hydraulics and vintage wood cabinets, he was the chief vault technician who set the mechanical time locks on every First National branch from Eugene to Seattle. Now, Garrett said, leaning forward just enough so Vance had to look him in the eye. Box 440912 isn't recorded under the 1999 State Banking Act. It was set up under a dual-signatory trust escrow under the 1974 Commercial Code. That means it's not an estate asset. It's an escrow repository. And under Section 9 of your own charter, a secondary stem key holder with physical custody of the master mechanical key has absolute right of inspection prior to any corporate freeze. Vance stared at the blue card. Then he looked at Garrett. "Sir, I'd have to check with legal." "You call them," Garrett said calmly. "And while you've got them on the phone, ask them about line 4 on receipt number 440912. Ask them if they want to explain to the state banking commissioner why a dual signatory escrow box was frozen without 72 hours written notice to the secondary trustee." You could hear a pin drop on that marble floor. Vance's face went completely pale. The corporate polish disappeared in about 3 seconds flat. He looked down at Garrett's calloused hands resting on the desk, hands that looked like they had turned every bolt in the county, and then he looked at the brass key. "Follow me," Vance whispered. They walked down a spiral concrete staircase into the deep basement of the bank, where the air was 10 degrees cooler and smelled like oil and cold iron. Down past 3 security gates to the massive steel vault door. Vance pulled out the master guard key, inserted it into the left keyhole of box 440912, and stepped back. Garrett reached into his pocket, took out the small brass key with the number 440912 taped to it, and slid it into the right lock. Click. A deep, heavy metallic snap echoed off the vault walls. Garrett pulled the long tin deposit box out of the wall and set it down on the brass viewing table in the center of the room. He turned to Helena and gave her a slow, steady nod. Helena pulled her father's pocket watch from her coat. She set it right beside the tin box. Tick tick tick, the steady, 20-year-old pulse of Swiss brass gears filling the quiet room. She lifted the lid of the box. Sitting right on top was a thick manila envelope sealed with red banker's wax, bearing Augustus Sterling's handwritten signature across the flap, and right underneath it, a small, faded tag that read, Asterisk, Helena's Trust, Section 14, Air Clause. Asterisk. Helena broke the red wax with her fingernail and pulled out the top document. Her hand began to shake. "Garrett," she whispered. "Look at this date." 1998, Helena whispered again, her voice barely a breath. "Garrett, this document, it's dated April 14, 1998. You know, the air just went out of that vault." Vance, the bank manager. His eyes were wide, fixed on the paper. Because if you know anything about the Sterling Trust, you'd know that Julian Sterling, Augustus's nephew, the one who supposedly vanished without a trace, well, he was declared legally deceased in late '99. Which means this document. This was before. Garrett leaned closer, his eyes scanning the elegant script. "It's the original trust clause," he said, not to Helena, but almost to himself, his voice a low rumble that filled the quiet space. "The one Burl hid. Specifically, Section 14, Article 7. He looked up at Vance, a sharp, unblinking gaze. "It states that upon Augustus Sterling's passing, if Helena Sterling produced a legitimate biological heir who reached the age of 21, the temporary management stewardship of 51% of Sterling Maritime's voting shares, currently held by Julian Sterling, would immediately terminate. Control of the stock would automatically transfer to the heir, and that transfer triggers an immediate, non-negotiable, mandatory forensic audit of every bank account, pension fund, and corporate ledger controlled by the board. Vance swallowed hard, a visible bob in his throat. You could see the corporate training trying to reassert itself, but it was just failing. His polished facade was cracking. That's impossible," he stammered, his voice losing its boardroom crispness. "Julian Sterling has held absolute control of Sterling Maritime for 20 years. He was granted full stewardship based on Helena Sterling being declared deceased without issue." Helena was already flipping through the document, her fingers tracing the neat columns of figures. "And look here, Garrett," she said, her voice regaining strength. "It lists the exact percentage of voting shares, the transfer date, Clara's 21st birthday, and the explicit mandate for the audit. And a note. A handwritten note by Augustus himself." She read it aloud, her voice clear in the echoing vault, "For Helena's heir, should one arise. Let no man obstruct their rightful claim. Guard this truth well. The words hung in the cold, still air. And right there, beside the tin box, Augustus's pocket watch continued its relentless tick-tick-tick. A silent, brass testament to a promise made decades ago. Vance looked like he'd seen a ghost. His eyes were darting between Garrett, Helena, the documents, and that ticking watch. But the company. "Julian is closing the sale of Sterling Maritime to a foreign consortium tomorrow morning," he blurted out, the panic finally breaking through. "10 a.m. sharp. The deal's been publicly listed for weeks." Garrett didn't flinch. He just calmly closed the document. "I'm aware," he said. "The online listing, the Global Investment Opportunity brochure. A rather aggressive marketing push, if you ask me." He looked at Vance, his eyes suddenly sharp. "Now, what's the procedure for an immediate asset freeze and transfer of corporate control when said claim is backed by legally binding, previously unfiled trust amendments and a comprehensive audit mandate?" Vance just gaped. He stammered something about legal departments and emergency injunctions. Garrett cut him off, his voice firm. "We don't have time for emergency injunctions, Mr. Vance. Not with 19 hours left until that deal closes. What we need is a direct intervention. From the bank." He tapped the escrow box. "This box, this key, this information, it changes everything. And you are the representative of the institution that just opened it." He didn't raise his voice, not one bit. But the weight of those words, the absolute certainty in his tone, it just filled that vault. You could practically see Vance's mind racing, trying to calculate the legal fallout, the PR nightmare, the sheer cost of letting that sale proceed. Helena looked at Garrett, then at the pocket watch. She picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, the steady pulse against her palm. She knew what needed to happen next. They couldn't let it go to sale. Not after all this. Not after her grandfather's last wish, spelled out right there in ink and brass. "The clock's ticking, Mr. Vance," Garrett said, his voice flat. "Julian Sterling's empire is about to be sold off. What are you going to do about it?" Vance wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. He looked at the vault door, then at the sealed envelope, then back at Garrett. There's a protocol," he finally whispered. "A very rarely used protocol. For immediate asset freezes tied to pending legal claims of pre-existing trust obligations." He looked like he was pulling it from the very back of his memory. "It requires an executive sign-off. From the regional director." Garrett nodded slowly. "Then I suggest you make that call, Mr. Vance. Immediately." They left the vault, the heavy door thudding shut behind them. Vance's face was still pale, but there was a flicker of something new in his eyes now. Not just fear, but a dawning realization of the absolute mess he was in. And Garrett? He just walked, calm as could be, the subtle click of the pocket watch from Helena's coat the only sound in the marble hall. The next 19 hours were going to be a long, long day. 18 hours. That was all the time remaining on the big wall clock in the main branch lobby when Mr. Vance finally stepped into his glass-walled corner office to make that phone call. Now, you have to understand something about corporate banks. They don't like surprises, and they certainly don't like 90-year-old trusts suddenly waking up from the dead on a Tuesday afternoon. Picture Garrett sitting on that high-backed leather sofa in the lobby, his hands resting quietly on his knees, not showing a single grain of stress. Beside him, Helena had her thumb pressed right against the smooth brass casing of her grandfather's pocket watch, feeling that quiet, steady tick through her winter coat. 4 minutes later, Vance came back out. And folks, he didn't look like a man who had just saved the day. He looked like a man who had just taken a very cold shower with his suit on. He held a yellow legal pad, his handwriting a jagged mess across the top margin. "I spoke to Regional Director Sterling," Vance said, his voice dropping down to a harsh whisper so the tellers couldn't hear. He refused the freeze. Helena's hand froze right over that watch. He what? The corporate counsel for the foreign consortium, a young fellow named Miller, fresh out of Columbia, just filed an emergency performance bond, Vance explained, wiping his forehead again with a crumpled handkerchief. Clause 14b of the Standard Master Acquisition Contract. It says that unless a physical copy of the original 1979 Sterling Trust Validation Certificate is produced, in person, with the wet ink seal, the bank has no legal authority to stop the sale. And Miller knows that certificate was reported destroyed during the regional merger back in 1994. He looked at Garrett like he was delivering a death sentence. "The system says the paper doesn't exist anymore, Mr. Callahan. Without that physical document, my hands are tied. The deal closes at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and there is nothing I can do." What would you have done right then? Because Helena felt the air get pulled right out of her chest. Her father's legacy, the future of her daughter, about to be lost forever, all because of an unfindable piece of paper buried under 30 years of corporate maneuvers. Instead, Garrett slowly unbuttoned his coat. He reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a small, worn leather address book tied with a faded rubber band, and flipped past 30 years of handwritten names until he reached the back cover. "Tell me, Mr. Vance," Garrett said, his tone as warm and calm as a neighbor talking over a picket fence. "When the bank consolidated its records during the '94 merger, who was the head of the archival audit team in Building B?" Vance blinked. I have no idea. That was long before my time." "His name was Thomas Vance," Garrett said softly. "Your uncle. A good man. Very thorough. He never destroyed a trust exemption certificate in his life. He catalogued them." Garrett pointed a quiet, calloused finger at the phone on Vance's desk. "You call Director Sterling back right now. You tell him to send a courier down to the sub-basement archive in the old Federal Reserve Annex on Adams Street. Locker 408, Shelf 3, metal container marked Series D11. Garrett pulled a tiny, rusted brass key from his vest pocket, not the key to the escrow box, but something older, smaller, and laid it flat on the desk next to the pocket watch. "Tell him the wet ink certificate is inside envelope number 712. Signed by your uncle. Witnessed by me." Vance stared at the key. Then he stared at Garrett. You could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, that dead, quiet sound when a room suddenly realizes who's actually running the show. You were there." Vance whispered. "I was the clerk who typed the index card, Mr. Vance," Garrett replied quietly. Now make the call. We have 17 hours left, and I don't intend to spend another one listening to excuses. Vance didn't say another word. He picked up the receiver with a hand that was visibly shaking, dialed 4 digits, and waited. 17 hours until the sale closes. The first line of defense had held, but the fight was just moving to the next room. Vance spoke quickly, nervously, his voice a low hum across the quiet office. You could almost hear Director Sterling's sharp, impatient reply on the other end, even though the call was muffled. There was a pause. A longer pause. Then Vance just nodded, once, twice. Yes, Director. I understand. Right away. He hung up, his eyes still wide, looking at Garrett as if he were seeing a ghost. He's sending someone, Vance said, his voice barely above a whisper. But he made it very clear, Mr. Callahan. This is a courtesy. He said even if your certificate exists, it's just a piece of old paper now. Not legally binding. Garrett just gave a slow, measured nod. We'll see about that, won't we? He pulled the small, tarnished brass key off the desk and tucked it back into his vest pocket, right beside the pocket watch. Just like that. As if he'd simply laid down a pawn, then moved it back. And you know, the next hour felt like a lifetime. It was just the two of them in that office, the air thick with unspoken questions. Vance kept glancing at Garrett, then at his phone, then at the clock on the wall. Garrett? He just sat there, quiet as a stone, watching the dust motes dance in the slivers of afternoon light that pushed through the blinds. You could almost hear the city outside, a distant hum, but in that room, it was just the ticking of Garrett's watch, a soft, rhythmic beat against the silence. Tick-tock, counting down. Then, a sharp knock on the door. A young woman in a crisp bank uniform, clutching a sealed brown envelope. She looked frazzled. Director Sterling sent me, Mr. Vance. Sub-basement archive. Locker 408, Shelf 3, Series D11. Envelope 712. She practically recited it, like she couldn't believe the instruction herself. She handed the envelope to Vance, who took it like it might bite him. Vance looked at Garrett, then back at the envelope. He tore it open, pulling out a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper. It was clearly old. Folded once, twice. You could see the faint crease marks. He held it up, peering at the faded ink. It was exactly what Garrett had described, a trust exemption certificate, dated 1994, signed by Thomas Vance, and then, below that, a second signature. A smaller, neater hand. G. Callahan. There it is, Vance said, his voice flat. He looked at Garrett. But it's just paper. Director Sterling said, he said this needs to be digitally registered. It needs a modern seal. A wet ink signature from nearly 30 years ago isn't going to hold up, Mr. Callahan. Not against a federal sale. He sounded almost relieved, like he'd found his escape hatch. Garrett didn't even flinch. He slowly reached into his inner coat pocket again, but this time, he pulled out something different. Not the address book. This was a folded, almost brittle piece of newsprint, yellowed at the edges. A newspaper clipping. He laid it gently on Vance's desk, pushing it across. Mr. Vance, Garrett said, his voice still that even, unhurried tone. Do you see the watermark on that certificate? Hold it up to the light. Vance hesitated, then picked up the certificate and held it near the lamp on his desk. He squinted. Yes, a faint symbol. An oak leaf and acorn. Precisely, Garrett confirmed. That wasn't just any paper, Mr. Vance. That was specifically commissioned watermarked bond paper, printed by the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing, exclusively for Federal Trust documents during the '94 merger consolidation. Each sheet had a unique micro-embossed serial number, embedded in the pulp itself. You won't find another like it. Only Director Thomas Vance and I had access to the requisition forms. Garrett tapped the newspaper clipping. And this, Mr. Vance, is a notice from the Federal Register, Volume 59, Issue 213, October 1994, officially designating those specific watermark certificates as permanently exempt from digital registration requirements, provided they bear the original wet ink signatures of the head auditor and a sworn federal clerk of record. Vance's jaw went slack. He looked from the certificate, to the newspaper clipping, to Garrett, and back again. The quiet clerk. The man who typed the index card. You could see the gears turning in his head. He was starting to realize that Garrett's knowledge wasn't just anecdotal. It was structural. It was foundational. A sworn federal clerk of record. Vance repeated, his voice barely a whisper. You were, a sworn clerk. Garrett merely nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. 22 years in the Federal Reserve System, Mr. Vance. Starting with the mailroom, eventually moving up to archival administration. I knew every paper, every seal, every regulation. He looked at the certificate again. That specific oak leaf watermark. It's harder to counterfeit than a dollar bill, because the paper itself was a secured asset. Vance slumped back in his chair. He picked up the newspaper clipping, reading the fine print, then back to the certificate, turning it over and over in his hands. You could see the glint of sweat on his forehead now. The room wasn't quiet anymore, it was humming with the frantic calculations happening inside Vance's head. 11 hours, Garrett said, checking his pocket watch with a gentle flick of his thumb. 11 hours until the sale closes, Mr. Vance. I suggest you make another call to Director Sterling. And this time, you tell him he can either honor a valid federal instrument, or he can explain to the regional superintendent why he's trying to invalidate a document that even the Bureau of Engraving and Printing vouches for. Vance just swallowed hard, his eyes still fixed on that oak leaf watermark. He picked up his phone again. The shaking in his hand was worse this time. You could feel the pressure building, like a slow-moving storm. The bank's official position, their polished veneer of legal authority, was starting to crack. And all Garrett had done was show them a piece of paper. An old, very specific piece of paper. Vance stared at his phone, his face gray. You could hear the muffled, frantic voice of Director Sterling on the other end, a furious, disbelieving mumble that slowly, as Vance spoke, turned into a desperate plea. Garrett watched, calm, as the storm brewed and broke over the bank's polished marble floors. When Vance finally hung up, he didn't even look at Garrett. He just gripped the edge of the conference table, his knuckles white. He's furious, Vance rasped, but he agrees. We can't dispute a federal instrument, not without calling the Bureau of Engraving and Printing directly. He's sending a representative to the closing meeting. A special directive. And that was it. Just like that, the gears of the system, so rigid and unyielding, began to shift. The bank, so sure of its power, suddenly found itself forced to acknowledge a quiet man with an old piece of paper. The corporate boardroom at Sterling Maritime Headquarters in Tacoma was usually a bastion of quiet power. But that afternoon, the air was electric. Julian Sterling, impeccably dressed as always, sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Across from him, Clara, looking poised and determined, sat beside Helena and Garrett Callahan. Mr. Vance, looking haggard but resolute, stood near the door with a small team of bank officials. The foreign consortium's representatives, their faces unreadable, occupied the far end of the table. The lead attorney for the consortium, a sharp-suited woman, cleared her throat. "Director Sterling," she began, her voice crisp, "we have received an unexpected, but irrefutable, directive from the First National Bank of Oregon. It appears the original trust clause for Sterling Maritime, specifically Section 14, Article 7, has been legally validated and asserted." Julian's eyes, cold and hard, flickered to Vance, then to Garrett. "This is a fabrication," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "An attempt at extortion by a ghost and a grease monkey." Garrett, sitting calmly, simply pulled out the cream-colored certificate with the oak leaf watermark and laid it on the table. "With all due respect, Mr. Sterling," Garrett said, his voice even, "the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and by extension, the Federal Reserve System, would disagree. This document, and the trust clause it validates, is as real as the 21-year-old woman sitting next to me." The attorney picked up the certificate, examining it carefully. "Indeed. The bank's directive confirms the authenticity of this Sterling Trust Validation Certificate. It also confirms the immediate termination of your temporary management stewardship, Director Sterling, and the transfer of 51% of Sterling Maritime's voting shares to Ms. Clara Callahan, effective immediately, as per the terms of Augustus Sterling's original trust." A collective gasp went around the table. Julian's face went white. "Furthermore," the attorney continued, her gaze unwavering, "the trust terms mandate an immediate and comprehensive forensic audit of all Sterling Maritime accounts, pension funds, and corporate ledgers. The Federal Reserve has already been notified, and their auditors are en route." Julian Sterling slammed his fist on the table, a sound that echoed through the room. "This is an outrage. I will fight this. I will bury you all in legal fees." But it was too late. The Foreign Consortium's lead representative, a stern-faced man, spoke up. "Our acquisition terms included a clause for unencumbered transfer of assets and a clean audit. This situation, Director Sterling, clearly violates those terms. We are withdrawing our offer, effective immediately." He stood, his team following suit. "Our apologies for the inconvenience, Ms. Callahan." Julian Sterling watched them leave, his empire crumbling around him. Helena, her eyes shining with tears, reached out and squeezed Clara's hand. Clara, her jaw set, looked at Julian, not with triumph, but with a quiet, resolute strength. 3 days later, the headlines screamed. "Sterling Maritime Pension Scandal Uncovered. CEO Julian Sterling Arrested." The news reports detailed the $210 million pension theft, the forged signatures, the shell corporations. Julian Sterling, the man worth billions, was led away in handcuffs, his tailored suits replaced by a drab prison jumpsuit. Clara Callahan, now the controlling shareholder of Sterling Maritime, immediately halted the foreign sale and initiated a full restitution plan for the defrauded pension fund. She brought in a new management team, focusing on ethical practices and employee welfare. She offered Helena a position on the board, and Helena, with a quiet strength, accepted, ready to rebuild her father's legacy the right way. Garrett Callahan, the grease monkey from Mist River, watched it all unfold from his quiet garage on Mill Street. He didn't want a seat on the board, or a share of the empire. He had his shop, his son Jesse, who was now a forensic data auditor assisting Clara's team, and the profound satisfaction of knowing he had helped right a 20-year-old wrong. He had found his wife, met his daughter, and brought down a corporate criminal. The quiet, steady focus of a man who hadn't expected anything surprising from life in 20 years had been utterly shattered, and in its place, he found a new purpose, a new family, and a new kind of peace. He still had grease under his fingernails, and his worn canvas jacket pulled tight against the chill. But now, when he looked in the mirror, he saw not just the gray eyes he shared with Clara and Jesse, but the reflection of a man who had, against all odds, truly changed the world for the better. And sometimes, that's the greatest legacy of all.